Memoirs of North America, containing a geographical description of that vast continent, the customs and commerce of the inhabitants, etc. Sir, in my former letters, I presented you with a view of the English and French colonies, the commerce of Canada, the navigation upon the rivers and lakes of that country, the course of sailing from Europe to North America, the several attempts made by the English to master the French colonies, the incursions of the French upon New England and upon the Iroquois country. In a word, sir, I have revealed a great many things that for reasons of state or politics have been hitherto concealed, insomuch that if you were capable of making me a sacrifice to your resentment, 'tis now in your power to ruin me at court by producing my letters. All that I writ in the foregoing letters, and the whole substance of the memoirs I now send you, is truth as plain as the sunshine. I flatter no man, and I spare nobody. I scorn to be partial. I bestow due praise upon those who are in no capacity to serve me, and I censure the conduct of others that are capable of doing me an injury by indirect methods. I am not influenced by that principle of interest and party-making that is the rule of some folks' words. I sacrifice all to the love of truth, and write with no other view than to give you a just representation of things as they are. 'Tis beneath me to mince or alter the matter of fact, contained either in the letters I sent you some 10 or 12 years ago, or in these memoirs. In the course of my voyages and travels, I took care to keep particular journals of everything, but a minute relation of all particulars would be irksome to you. Besides, that the trouble of taking a copy of the journals before I have an opportunity of showing you the original would require more time than I can well spare. In these memoirs you'll find as much as will serve to form a perfect idea of the vast continent of North America. In the course of our correspondence, from the year 1683 to this time, I sent you 25 letters, of all which I have kept a double very carefully. My only view in writing of these letters was to inform you of the most essential things, for I was unwilling to perplex and confound your thoughts with an infinity of uncommon things that have happened in that country. If you'll consult my maps as you read the above-mentioned letters, you'll find a just representation of all the places I have spoke of. These maps are very particular, and I dare assure you, they are the correct yet extant. My voyage upon the long river gave me an opportunity of making that little map, which I sent you from Missilimakinac in 1699 with my 16th letter. 'Tis true, it gives only a bare description of that river, and the river of the Missouris, but it required more time than I could spare to make it more complete by a knowledge of the adjacent countries, which have hitherto been unknown to all the world, as well as that great river, and which I would never have visited if I had not been fully instructed in everything that related to it, and convoyed by a good guard. I have placed the map of Canada at the front of these memoirs, and desire that favor of you, that you would not show it to anybody under my name. To the latter part I have subjoined an explication of the marine and other difficult terms made use of in my letters, as well as in these memoirs, which you'll please to consult when you meet with a word that you do not understand. A short description of Canada. You'll think, sir, that I advance a paradox when I acquaint you that New France, commonly called Canada, comprehends a greater extent of ground than the half of Europe. But pray mind what proof I have for that assertion. You know that Europe extends south and north, from the 35 to the 72 degree of latitude, or, if you will, from Cadiz to the North Cape on the confines of Lapland, and that its longitude reaches from the 9th to the 94th degree, that is, from the river Obi to the West Cape in Islandia. But at the same time, if we take the greatest breadth of Europe, from east to west, from the imaginary canal, for instance, between the Tanais and the Volga, to Dingle Bay in Ireland, it makes but 66 degrees of longitude, which contain more leagues than the degrees allotted to it towards the polar circle, though these are more numerous, by reason that the degrees of longitude are unequal, and since we are wont to measure provinces, islands, and kingdoms by the space of ground, I am of the opinion that we ought to make use of the same standard, with respect to the 4 parts of the world. The geographers, who parcel out the earth in their closets according to their fancy, these gentlemen, I say, might have been aware of this advance if they had been more careful. But to come to Canada, all the world knows that Canada reaches from the 39th to the 65th degree of latitude. That is, from the south side of the Lake Erie to the north side of Hudson's Bay, and from the 284th to the 336th degree of longitude, viz. From the river Mississippi to Cape Ras in the island of Newfoundland. I affirm, therefore, that Europe has but 11 degrees of latitude and 33 of longitude more than Canada, in which I comprehend the island of Newfoundland, Acadia, and all the other countries that lie to the northward of the river of St. Lawrence, which is the pretended great boundary that severs the French colonies from the English. Were I to reckon in all the countries that lie to the northwest of Canada, I should find it larger than Europe, but I confine myself to what is discovered, known and owned, I mean, to the countries in which the French trade with the natives for beavers, and in which they have forts, magazines, missionaries, and small settlements. 'Tis above a century and a half since Canada was discovered. John Verrazan was the first discoverer, though he got nothing by it, for the savages eat him up. James Cartier was the next that went thither, but after sailing with a ship above Quebec, he returned to France with a sorry opinion of the country. At last, better sailors were employed in the discovery, and traced the river of St. Lawrence more narrowly. In about the beginning of the last century, a colony was sent thither from Rouen, which settled there after a great deal of opposition from the natives. At this day, the colony is so populous that 'tis computed to contain 180,000 souls. I have already given you some account of that country in my letters, and therefore shall now only point to the most noted places, and take notice of what may gratify your curiosity beyond what you have yet heard. We are at a loss to find the head of the river of St. Lawrence, for though we have traced it 700 or 800 leagues up, yet we could never reach its source. The remotest place that the Courrier de Bois go to being the lake Lenemipigan, which disembogues into the upper lake, as the upper lake does into the Lake of Hurons, the Lake of Hurons into that of Erie, alias Conti, and that of Erie into the Lake of Frontenac, which forms this last great river that runs for 20 leagues with a pretty gentle stream, and sweeps through 30 more with a very rapid current till it reaches the city of Montreal, from whence it continues its course with some moderation to the city of Quebec, and after that spreads out, and enlarges itself by degrees to its mouth, which lies 100 leagues further. If we may credit the North Country savages, this river takes its rise from the great lake of the Assinipoils, which they give out to be larger than any of the lakes I mentioned but now, being situated at the distance of 50 or 60 leagues from the lake of Lenemipigan. The river of St. Lawrence is 20 or 22 leagues broad at its mouth, in the middle of which there's an island called Anticosti, which is 20 leagues long. This island belongs to the Sieur Joliet, a Canadan, who has built a little fortified magazine upon it, to guard his goods and his family from the incursions of the Eskimos, of whom more anon. He deals with the other savage nations, namely the Montagnois and the Papipanachoes, in arms and ammunition, by way of exchange for the skins of sea wolves or sea calves and some other furs. Over against this island, to the southward of it, we find the isle called L'Île Percée, which is a great rock with a passage bored through it, in which the sloops can only pass. In time of peace, the Biscayans of France and the Normans used to fish for cod at this place, for here that fish are very plentiful, and at the same time larger and more proper for drying than those of Newfoundland. But there are 2 great inconveniencies that attend the fishing upon this land. One is that the ship ride in great danger, unless they have good anchors and strong cables. Another inconvenience is that this place affords neither gravel nor flintstones to stretch out the fish upon before the sun, and that the fishermen are forced to make use of a sort of hurdles. There are other fishing places besides this, which lie some leagues higher up upon the same side of the river, such as that called Gaspe, where the ship's crew sometimes trade in skins with the Gaspesians to the prejudice of the proprietors of this river. The other places for codfish lie towards Mont Notre Dame, in the little bays or rivers that empty themselves into the river of St. Lawrence. On the other side of the river, there lies the wide extended country of Labrador, or of the Eskimos, who are such a wild, barbarous people that no means whatsoever have hitherto been able to civilize them. One would think that good old Homer had this people in his view when he speaks of the Cyclopes, for the character of the one suits the other admirably well, as it appears from these 4 verses in the 9th book of his Odyssea, which are so pretty that I cannot forbear inserting them in this place. Frankly, I don't speak Greek, but I believe it refers to the following passage from the Odyssey as Ulysses reaches the island of the Cyclopes. They have no laws nor assemblies of the people, but live in caves on the tops of high mountains. Each is lord and master in his family, and they take no account of their neighbors. That is, this people do not perplex themselves with voluminous laws and vexatious suits. They delight only in the tops of mountains and deep caves, and everyone confines his care to the management of his own family, without troubling his head about his neighbor. The Danes were the first discoverers of this country, which is full of ports, havens, and bays that the Quebec barks resort to in the summer, in order to truck with the savages for the skins and sea calves. The commerce I speak of is carried on after this manner. As soon as the Quebec barks come to an anchor, these devils come on board of them in their little canoes made of the skin of sea calves, in the form of a weaver's shuttle, with a hole in the middle of it resembling that of a purse, in which they stow themselves with ropes, sitting squat upon their bridge. Being set in this fashion, they row with little slices, sometimes to the right and sometimes to the left, without bending their body for fear of oversetting. As soon as they are near the bark, they hold up their skins upon the end of the oar, and at the same time make a demand of so many knives, powder, ball, fuses, axes, kettles, etc. In fine, everyone shows what he has and mentions what he expects in exchange, and so when the bargain is concluded, they deliver and receive their goods upon the end of a stick. As these pitiful fellows use the precaution of not going on board of our boats, so we take care not to suffer too great a number of canoes to surround us, for they have carried off oftener than once some of our small vessels, at a time when the seamen were busied in hauling in the skins and delivering out the other goods. Here we are obliged to be very vigilant in the night time, for they know how to make great sloops that will hold 30 or 40 men, and run as fast as the wind. And 'tis for this reason that the Malouins, who fish for cod at Petit Nord, and the Spaniards who follow the same fishery at Porto Chua, are obliged to sit out long barks to scour the coast and pursue them, for almost every year they surprise some of the crew on shore, and cut their throats, and sometimes they carry off the vessel. We are assured that their number of warriors, or men that bear arms, amounts to 30,000. But they are such cowardly fellows that 500 Clistinos from Hudson's Bay used to defeat 5,000 or 6,000 of them. They are possessed of a very large country, extending from over against the Isles of Mingan to Hudson Strait. They cross over to the island of Newfoundland every day, at the Strait of Belle Isle, which is not above 7 leagues over, but they never come so far as Placentia, for fear of meeting with other savages there. Hudson's Bay adjoins to this Terra of Labrador, and extends from the 52nd degree and 30 minutes to the 63 of latitude. The original of its name was this: Captain Henry Hudson, an Englishman by birth, obtained a ship from the Dutch in order to trace a passage to China through an imaginary strait to the northward of North America. He had first formed a design of going by the way of Nova Zembla, but upon seeing the memoirs of a Danish pilot who was a friend of his, he dropped that thought. This pilot, namely Frederick Anschild, had set out from Norway to Islandia some years before, with a design to find out a passage to Japan by Davis Strait, which is the chimerical strait I spoke of. The first land he descried was Savage Bay, seated on the north side of the Terra of Labrador. Then, sweeping along the coast, he entered a strait, which about 20 or 30 leagues afterward was christened Hudson Strait. After that, steering to the westward, he came upon some coasts that run north and south, upon which he stood to the north, flattering himself with the hopes of finding an open passage to cross the Sea of Gesso. But after sailing to the latitude of the polar circle and running the risk of perishing in the ice, I do not know how often, without meeting with any passage or open sea, he took up a resolution of turning back, but the season was then so far advanced, and the ice so covered up the surface of the water, that he was forced to put into Hudson's Bay, and winter there in a harbor where several savages furnished his crew with provisions and excellent skins. As soon as the sea was open, he returned to Denmark. Now, Captain Hudson, being afterwards acquainted with this Dane, undertook upon his journals to attempt a passage to Japan through the Strait of Davis, but the enterprise failed, as well as that one Button and some others. However, Hudson put into the bay that now goes by his name, where he received a great quantity of skins from the savages. After that, he discovered New Holland, which is now called New York, and some other countries retaining to New England. Upon the whole, 'tis not fair to call this strait and this bay by the name of Hudson, in regard that the above-mentioned Dane, Frederick Anschild, was the first discoverer of them, he being the first European that descried the countries of North America and chalked out the way to the others. Upon this Hudson's journals, the English made several attempts to settle a commerce with the Americans. The great quantity of beaver skins and other furs that he purchased of the savages while he wintered in the bay put the notion into the heads of some English merchants, who thereupon formed a company for the carrying on of this new commerce. With this view, they fitted out some ships under the command of Captain Nelson, who lost some of them in the ice not far from the strait, having escaped narrowly himself. However, he entered the bay and placed himself at the mouth of a great river, which rises towards the lake of the Assiniboines and falls into the bay at the place where he built a redoubt and mounted some cannon upon it. In the space of 3 or 4 years after, the English made some other little forts near that river, which proved a considerable bulk to the commerce of the French, who found that the savages who used to deal with them in furs on the north side of the upper lake were not then to be seen. It came to pass in process of time, but how I cannot tell, that one Radisson and one Groseilliers met in that great lake some Clistinos, who promised to conduct them to the bottom of the bay, where the English had not yet penetrated. In effect, the Clistinos were as good as their word, for they show 'em the place they spoke of, besides several other rivers upon which there was a fair prospect of making such settlements as would carry on a great trade in skins with several savage nations. These 2 Frenchmen returned to the upper lake, the same way that they went, and from thence made the best of their way to Quebec, where they offered to the chief merchants of the place to carry ships to Hudson's Bay, but their project was rejected. In fine, having met with this repulse, they went to France, in hope of a more favorable hearing at court. But after the presenting of memorial upon memorial and spending a great deal of money, they were treated as whimsical fellows. Upon that occasion, the King of England's ambassador did not lose the opportunity of persuading them to go to London, where they met with such a favorable reception that they got several ships, which they carried to the bay, not without difficulty, and built several forts in different places that did great service in promoting the commerce. Then the court of France repented, though too late, that they did not give ear to their memorials, and finding no other remedy, resolved to dislodge the English at any rate. In effect, they attacked them vigorously by sea and land, and dispossessed them of all their forts, excepting Fort Nelson, where they could not expect such an easy conquest. Some years after, the English resolved to use their utmost efforts to retake these posts, and their resolution was crowned with success, for they dislodged the French in their turn, and at this day the French are making preparations to repay them in their own coin. That country is so cold for 7 or 8 months of the year that the sea freezes 10 foot deep. The trees and the very stones split. The snow is 10 or 12 foot deep upon the ground for above 6 months of the year, and during that season nobody can steer out of doors without running the risk of having their nose, ears, and feet mortified by the cold. The passage from Europe to that country is so difficult and dangerous, by reason of the ice and the currents, that one must be reduced to the last degree of misery, or be blinded to a foolish height that undertakes such a wretched voyage. 'Tis now time to pass from Hudson's Bay to the Superior or Upper Lake. 'Tis easier to make this voyage upon paper than to go actually through it, for you must sail almost 100 leagues up the river of Machacandibi, which is so rapid and full of cataracts that a light canoe worked by 6 watermen shall not sail them under 30 or 35 days. At the head of this river we meet with a little lake of the same name, from whence we are obliged to a land carriage of 7 leagues to get at the river of Michipicoton, which we run down in 10 or 12 days, though at the same time we have several land carriages upon it. For going down this river, we pass several cataracts, where we are obliged either to carry our canoes by land or to drag them back again. Thus we arrive at the upper lake, which is reckoned to be 500 leagues in circumference, including the windings of the creeks and little gulfs. This little freshwater sea is calm enough from the beginning of May to the end of September. The south side is the safest for the canoes, by reason of the many bays and little rivers where one may put in case of a storm. There is no settled savage nation upon the brinks of the lake that I know of. 'Tis true indeed that in summer several northern nations come to hunt and fish in these parts, and bring with them the beaver skins they have got in the winter, in order to truck with the coureurs de bois, who do not sail to meet them there every year. The places where the interview happens are Bagosach, Lemipisaki, and Chawamigon. 'Tis some years since Mr. Dullhut built a fort of pails or stakes upon this lake, where he had large magazines of all sorts of goods. That fort was called Kamanistigoyen, and did considerable disservice to the English settlements in Hudson's Bay, by reason that it saved several nations the trouble of transporting their skins to that bay. Upon that lake we find copper mines, the metal of which is so fine and plentiful that there is not a 7th part loss from the ore. It has some pretty large islands, which are replenished with elks and wild asses, but there's scarce any that goes to hunt upon them, by reason of the danger of crossing over. In fine, this lake abounds with sturgeons, trouts, and whitefish. The climate is unsufferably cold for 6 months of the year, and the snow joined to the frost commonly freezes the water of the lake for 10 or 12 leagues over. From the Superior or Upper Lake, I steered to that of Hurons, to which I allot 400 leagues in circumference. Now to make this lake, you must sail down by the fall called Sault Ste. Marie, which I described in my 15th letter. This lake is situated in a fine climate, as you'll perceive from the map. The north side of it is best for the navigation of canoes, by reason of the frequency of isles which afford shelter in bad weather. The south side is pleasanter and more convenient for the hunting of deer, which are there very plentiful. The figure of this lake comes near to an equilateral triangle. Of all its isles, that called Manitoulin is the most considerable, being above 20 leagues long and 10 broad. In former times, the Ottawas of the nations of Talon and Sable dwelt in it, but the dread they were under upon the account of the Iroquois obliged both them and their neighbors to retire to Missilimakinac. That part of the continent that faces this island is inhabited by the Nuks and the Mistakes in two different villages, which are 20 leagues distant the one from the other. Towards the east end of this island, we fall in with the River de Francois, which I took notice of in my 16th letter. 'Tis as broad as the Seine is at Paris, and runs not above 40 leagues in length from its source in the lake Nepiserini to its mouth. To the northwest of this river there lies the Bay of Toronto, which is 20 or 25 leagues long and 15 broad at its mouth. This bay receives a river that springs from a little lake of the same name and forms several cataracts that are equally impracticable both upon the ascent and descent. Upon the side of this river you'll see a man's head marked in my map, which signifies a large village of the Hurons that was destroyed by the Iroquois. You may go from the source of this river to the Lake Frontenac by making a land carriage to the river of Tanoate that falls into that lake. Upon the south side of the Bay of Toronto, you see the fort called the Fort Suppose, which I mentioned in my 23rd letter, and about 30 leagues to the southward of that, you'll find the country of Tionontate, which being formerly inhabited by the Hurons, was entirely depopulated by the Iroquois. From thence I pass directly to my fort, without amusing you with the different landscapes I meet with in the space of 30 leagues. That fort I have spoke so often of already, that without stopping there I shall run directly to the Bay of Sakinac, reckoning it needless at the same time to take any notice of the many shelves and rocks that lie hid under the water for 2 leagues off the coast. This bay is 16 or 17 leagues long, and 6 broad at its mouth, in the middle of which we meet with 2 little islands that are very serviceable to the passengers. For if it were not for the conveniency of putting in there, they would be obliged for the most part rather to march quite round the bay than to run the hazard of crossing directly over in a canoe. The river of Sakinac falls into the bottom of the bay. This river runs 60 leagues in length, with a gentle current, having only 3 little cataracts that one may shoot without danger. 'Tis as broad as the Seine is at Sèvres Bridge. Once in 2 years the Ottawas and the Hurons are wont to hunt great quantities of beavers upon the confines of the river of Sakinac. Between the river I now speak of and Missilimakinac we meet with no place that is worth our regard. As for Missilimakinac itself, I have already imparted to you all that I can say of that post, which is of so great importance to our commerce, and at the same time sent you a draught of it. I shall therefore pursue my course to the Lake Erie, remembering that I described the Illinois Lake in my 16th letter. The Lake Erie is justly dignified with the illustrious name of Conti, for assuredly 'tis the finest lake upon the earth. You may judge of the goodness of the climate from the latitudes of the countries that surround it. Its circumference extends to 230 leagues, but it affords everywhere such a charming prospect that its banks are decked with oak trees, elms, chestnut trees, walnut trees, apple trees, plum trees, and vines, which bear their fine clusters up to the very top of the trees, upon a sort of ground that lies as smooth as one's hand. Such ornaments as these are sufficient to give rise to the most agreeable idea of a landscape in the world. I cannot express what vast quantities of deer and turkeys are to be found in these woods, and in the vast meads that lie upon the south side of the lake. At the bottom of the lake we find wild beeves upon the banks of 2 pleasant rivers that disembourge into it, without cataracts or rapid currents. It abounds with sturgeon and whitefish, but trouts are very scarce in it, as well as the other fish that we take in the lakes of Hurons and Illinois. 'Tis clear of shelves, rocks, and banks of sand, and has 14 or 15 fathom water. The savages assure us that 'tis never disturbed with high winds, but in the months of December, January, and February, and even then but seldom, which indeed I am very apt to believe, for we had but very few storms when I wintered in my fort in 1688, though the fort lay open to the Lake of Hurons. The banks of this lake are commonly frequented by none but warriors, whether the Iroquois, the Illinois, the Omamis, etc., and 'tis very dangerous to stop there. By this means it comes to pass that the stags, roebucks, and turkeys run in great bodies up and down the shore, all round the lake. In former times the Erironons and the Andostogironons lived upon the confines of this lake, but they were extirpated by the Iroquois, as well as the other nations marked in the map. Upon the north side of the lake we descry the point of land that shoots 15 leagues into the main, and about 30 leagues beyond that to the eastward we meet with a small river that takes its rise near the bay of Ganarask in the lake of Frontenac, and would afford a short passage from the one lake to the other, if 'twere not encumbered with cataracts. From thence to the strait or mouth of the lake you have 30 leagues, the strait being a league over and 14 leagues long. Upon this strait you see Fort Supposed, marked in the map, which is one of the forts that I mentioned in my 23rd letter. From that imaginary fort to the river of Conde we have 20 leagues. The river of Conde runs 60 leagues in length without cataracts, if we may credit the savages who assured me that one may go from its source to another river that falls into the sea without any other land carriage than one of a league in length between the river and the other. I saw only the mouth of the first river, where our Ottawas tried their limb, as I told you in my 15th letter. The islands that you see marked in the map at the bottom of the Lake Erie are replenished with roebucks and with fruit trees, which nature has generously provided in order to entertain the turkeys, pheasants, and deer with their fruit. In fine, if there were a clear and free passage for vessels from Quebec to this lake, it might be made the finest, the richest, and the most fertile kingdom in the world, for over and above all the beauties I have mentioned, there are excellent silver mines about 20 leagues up the country, upon a certain hill, from whence the savages brought us great lumps that have yielded that precious metal with little waste. From the Lake Erie, I steer my course to that of Frontenac, which I could not forbear to speak of in my 7th and 17th letters. This lake, as I intimated above, is 180 leagues in circumference. Its figure is oval, and its depth runs between 20 and 25 fathom. On the south side, it receives several little rivers, particularly those of the Tsonontuans, of the Onontagues, and of the Famine. On the north side, 'tis joined by the rivers of Ganarask and of Teonontete. Its sides are decked with tall trees, and the ground is indifferent, even and level, for it has no steep coasts. On the north side we meet with several little gulfs. You may go from this river to that of Hurons by going up the river Tanawate, from whence you have a land carriage of 6 or 8 leagues to the river of Toronto, which falls into it. You may likewise have a passage from the Lake of Frontenac to that of Erie, through the Bay of Ganarask, by making a land carriage from thence to a little river that's full of cataracts. The villages of the Onontagues, Tsontonuans, Goyogoans, and Onoyotes are not far distant from the Lake of Frontenac. These Iroquois nations are very advantageously seated. They have a pleasant and fertile country, but they want roebucks and turkeys, as well as fish, of which their rivers are altogether destitute, insomuch that they are forced to fish in the lake and to broil or dry their fish with a fire, in order to keep them and transport them to their villages. They are in like manner forced to range out of their territories in quest of beavers in the wintertime, either towards Ganarask or to the sides of the Lake of Toronto, or else towards the great river of the Ottawas, where it would be an easy matter to cut all their throats by pursuing the course I laid down in my letters. I have already touched upon the forts of Frontenac and Niagara, as well as upon the river of St. Lawrence. which here takes leave of the lakes and pursues a compacter course to Montreal and Quebec, where its waters mingling with those of the sea become so brackish that they are not drinkable. It remains only to give you a description of Acadia and the island of Newfoundland, which are two countries that differ widely from one another. The coast of Acadia extends from Kennebec, one of the frontiers of New England, to L'Isle Percé, near the mouth of the river of St. Lawrence. The seacoast runs almost 300 leagues in length and has upon it two great navigable bays, namely the bay called François and the Baie des Chaleurs. It has a great many little rivers, the mouths of which are deep and clean enough for the greatest ships. These rivers would afford a plentiful salmon fishery if there were anybody to undertake it, and most of them, as well as the gulfs that lies before them, furnished such cods as we take at the Isle Percé. For in the summertime, that sort of fish make into the coast in shoals, especially about the islands of Cape Breton and of St. John. 'Tis true, the latter has no harbors, and the former has none that receive any vessel above the burthen of a bark. But if these two islands were peopled, the inhabitants might sit out sloops to manage the fishery, and towards the latter end of August, when the fish are cured and ready, the ships might come to an anchor near the land, and so take 'em in. Two gentlemen of the name of Amour of Quebec have a settlement for beaver hunting upon the river of St. John, which is a very pleasant river and adorned with fields that are very fertile in grain. 'Tis navigable for 12 leagues up from its mouth. Between the point of Acadia and the island of Cape Breton, there is a channel or strait about 2 leagues in breadth, which is deep enough to carry the greatest ships in France. 'Tis called the Pas de Canso, and would be much more frequented than it is if the merchantmen bound to Canada would set out from France about the 15th of March, for then they might pass that way, being assured of a clear passage at all seasons of the year. Whereas the channel of Cape de Ray is oftentimes covered with ice in April, and by this contrivance the ships would arrive at Quebec in the beginning of May. Most of the countries of Acadia abound with corn, peas, fruit, and pulse, and have a plain distinction of the 4 seasons of the year, notwithstanding that 'tis extreme cold for 3 months in winter. Several places of Acadia afford masts as strong as those we have from Norway, and if there were occasion, all sorts of ships might be built there. For if you'll believe the carpenters, the oak of that country is better than ours in Europe. In a word, 'tis a very fine country. The climate is indifferent, temperate, the air is pure and wholesome, the waters clear and light, and there's good accommodation for hunting, shooting, and fishing. The animals that we meet with there most commonly are beavers, otters, and sea calves, all of them being very numerous. Those who love meat are indebted to the doctors who persuaded the popes to metamorphose these terrestrial animals into fish, for they are allowed to eat of them without scruple in the time of Lent. To be plain, the knowledge I have of that country makes me foresee that the English will be masters of it some time or other. I could give you very plausible reasons for the prophecy. They have already begun to ruin the commerce that the French had with the savages, and in a short time they'll compass its entire destruction. The French they will price their goods too high, though they are not so good as those of the English, and yet the English sell their commodities cheaper. 'Twere a pity that we should tamely leave to the English a country, the conquest of which they have attempted so often, in consideration of our fur trade and cod fishing. 'Tis impossible to hinder them to possess themselves of the settlements upon the coast of Acadia, by reason that they lie at such a distance from one another, so that they'll certainly succeed in such enterprises, as indeed they have done already. The French governors, they act with the same view as many of those who are employed in posts beyond sea. They look upon their place as a gold mine, given them in order to enrich themselves, so that the public good must always march behind private interests. Mr. de Meneval suffered the English to possess themselves of Port Royal, because that place was covered with nothing but single palisadoes. But why was it not better fortified? I can tell you the reason. he thought he had time enough to fill his pockets before the English would attack it. This governor succeeded to Mr. Perrault, who was broke with disgrace for having made it his chief business to enrich himself, and after returning to France, went back again with several ships laden with goods in order to set up for a private merchant in that country. While Mr. Perrault was governor, he suffered the English to possess themselves of several advantageous posts without offering to steer. His chief business was to go in barks from river to river in order to traffic with the savages, and after he was disgraced, he was not contented with a commerce upon the coast of Acadia, but would needs extend it to the English plantations. But it cost him dear, for some pirates fell in with him, and after seizing his barks, ducked himself, upon which he died immediately. The three principal savage nations that live upon the coasts of Acadia are the Abenakis, the Mi'kmaq, and the Kanibas. There are some other erratic nations who go and come from Acadia to New England and go by the names of Mahingans, Sokokis, and the Openango. The first three, having 6 habitations, are entirely in the interests of the French, and I must say that in time of war they gall the English colonies with their incursions, so much that we ought to take care to perpetuate a good understanding between them and us. The Baron of St. Castains, a gentleman of Oleron in Bern, having lived amongst the Abenakis after the savage way for above 20 years, is so much respected by the savages that they look upon him as their tutelar god. He was formerly an officer of the Carignan regiment in Canada, and upon the breaking of that regiment, threw himself among the savages, whose language he had learned. He married among them after their fashion, and preferred the forest of Acadia to the Pyrenean mountains that encompass the place of his nativity. For the first years of his abode with the savages, he behaved himself so as to draw an inexpressible esteem from them. They made him their great chief or leader, who is in a manner the sovereign of the nation, and by degrees he has worked himself into such a fortune, which any man but he would have made such use of, as to draw out of that country above 200,000 or 300,000 crowns, which he has now in his pocket in good dry gold. But all the use he makes of it is to buy up goods for presents to his fellow savages, who upon their return from hunting present him with beaver skins to a treble value. The governors general of Canada keep in with him, and the governors of New England are afraid of him. He has several daughters who are all of them married very handsomely to Frenchmen and hath good dowries. He has never changed his wife, by which means he meaned to give the savages to understand that God does not love inconstant folks. 'Tis said that he endeavored to convert these poor people, but his endeavors proved successless, so that 'tis in vain for the Jesuits to preach up the truths of Christianity to him. Though after all, these good fathers are not discouraged, nay, they think that the administering of baptism to a dying child is worth 10 times the pains and uneasiness of living among that people. Port Royal, the capital or the only city of Acadia, is in effect no more than a little poultry town that is somewhat enlarged since the war broke out in 1689 by the accession of the inhabitants that lived near Boston, the metropolitan of New England. A great many of these people retired to Port Royal upon the apprehension that the English would pillage them and carry them into their country. Mr. de Meneval surrendered this place to the English. As I said before, he could not maintain such a post with the handful of men that he had, because the palisadoes were low and out of order. He made a capitulation with the commander of the party that made the attack, but the English officer broke his word to him and used him both ignominiously and harshly. Port Royal is seated in the latitude of 44 degrees and 40 minutes upon the edge of a very fine basin, which is a league broad and 2 leagues long, having at the entry about 16 or 18 fathom water on one side and 6 or 7 on the other. For you must know that the island called L'Île aux Chèvres, which stands in the middle, divides the channel into 2. There's excellent anchorage all over the basin, and at the bottom of it there's a cape or point of land that parts two rivers, at which the tide rises 10 or 12 foot. These rivers are bounded by pleasant meads, which in spring and autumn are covered with all sorts of fresh waterfowl. In fine, Port Royal is only a handful of houses 2-story high, and has but few inhabitants of any note. It subsists upon the traffic of the skins, which the savages bring thither to truck for European goods. In former times, the Farmers' Company had magazines in this place, which were under the care of the governors. I could easily mention some of them, if I were not apprehensive that these memoirs may be seen by others beside yourself. The island of Newfoundland is 300 leagues in circumference. It lies at the distance of 650 leagues from France and 40 or 50 leagues from the bank of the same name. The south side of the island belongs to the French, who have several settlements there for the fishing of cod. The east side is inhabited by the English, who are possessed of several considerable posts, situated in certain ports, bays and havens, which they have taken care to fortify. The west of the island is waste, and was never yet possessed. The island is of a triangular figure, and full of mountains and impracticable forests. It has some great meadows, or rather heaths, which are covered with a sort of moss instead of grass. The soil of this country is good for nothing, as being a mixture of gravel, sand and stones, so that the fishery was the only motive that induced the French and the English to settle there. It affords great store of game, for waterfowl, partridges and hares. But as for the stags, 'tis almost impossible to come at them, by reason that the mountains are so high, and the woods so thick. In this island, as well as in that of Cape Breton, we find porphyry of several colors, and care has been taken to send to France some pieces of it for a pattern, which were found to be very pretty, only they were hard to cut. I have seen some of them that were red streaked with green, and seemed to be extreme fine, but the mischief is, it splits so when 'tis taken out of the quarries, that it cannot be made use of, but by way of incrustation. This island of Cape Breton affords likewise black marble, or a sort of breccia, with grey veins, which is hard, and not easily polished. This stone is apt to split, for 'tis not equally hard, and it has knots in it. There are no settled savages in the island of Newfoundland. 'Tis true, the Eskimo do sometimes cross over to it at the Strait of Belle Isle in great sloops, with intent to surprise the crew of the fishermen upon the coast called the Petit Nord. Our settlements are at Placentia, at the island of St. Peter, and in the bay of Trepassé. From Cape Ras to Chapeau Rouge, the coast is very clean, but from Chapeau Rouge to Cape Ras, the rocks render it dangerous. There are two considerable inconveniences that attend the landing upon this island. In the first place, the fogs are here so thick in the summer, for 20 leagues off into the main, that the ablest and most expert sailor dare not stand into the land while they last, so that all ships are obliged to lie by for a clear day in order to make the land. The second inconveniency, which is yet greater, proceeds from the currents which run to and again without any perceivable variation, by which means the ships are sometimes drove in upon the coast, when they reckon upon 10 leagues offing. But, which is worst of all, the insensible motion of the rolling waves throws them insensibly upon the rocks, which they cannot possibly avoid, for want of ground to anchor upon. 'Twas by this means that the king's ship, the Pretty, was lost in 1692, as well as a great many others upon several occasions. Of all of our settlements in North America, Placentia is the post of the greatest importance and service to the king, in regard that 'tis a place of refuge to the ships that are obliged to put into a harbor when they go or come from Canada, and even to those which come from South America, when they want to take in fresh water or provisions, and have sprung their masts or been damaged in a storm. This place is situated in the latitude of 47 degrees and some minutes, almost at the bottom of the bay that goes by the same name. The bay is 10 or 12 leagues broad, and 20 odd leagues long. The fort stands upon the side of a neck or narrow strait, which is 60 paces over and 6 fathoms water deep. The ships that enter into the port are obliged to grace, so to speak, upon the angle of the bastions. The port or harbor is a league long and a quarter of a league over. Before the port there's a large fine road, which is a league and a half wide, but lies so bleak to the northwest, and west-northwest winds, the strongest and most boisterous winds that are, that neither cables nor anchors, nor large stout ships can withstand their furious shocks, though indeed these violent storms seldom happen but in the later end of autumn. The same year that the Pretty was lost, the king lost another of 69 guns called the Good in this road, and if the 4 or 5 other ships that belonged to the same squadron had not took the precautions of steering into the port, they had certainly underwent the same fate. This road then, which is only exposed to the northwest and west-northwest winds, has some hidden rocks on the north side, besides those at Ponintvert, where several of the inhabitants are wont to fish. All these things you may see plainly upon the plan that I sent you along with my 23rd letter. Commonly, there comes 30 or 40 ships from France to Placentia every year, and sometimes 60. Some come with intent to fish, and others have no other design than to truck with the inhabitants, who live in the summertime on the other side of the fort. The ground upon which their houses stand is called La Grande Grave, for in effect they have nothing but gravel to spread their codfish upon, in order to have them dried by the sun after they are salted. The inhabitants and the French fishermen send their sloops every day 2 leagues off the port to pursue the fishery, and sometimes the sloops return so overloaded that they are in a manner buried in the water. You cannot imagine how deep they sink, and 'tis impossible you should believe it unless you saw it. The fishery commences in the beginning of June, and is at an end about the middle of August. In the harbor they catch a little sort of a fish, which they put upon their hooks as a bait for the cod. Placentia is in great want of gravel, which occasions the thinness of the inhabitants. If the governors preferred the king's service to avarice, they might make it a considerable post, and a great many would make gravel walks at their own charge. But as long as the governors prey upon the fortunes of private men, under the fair pretense of the king's service, which is always in their mouths, I can't see that this settlement will ever be enlarged or improved. Does not the governor disgrace his prince, and sink the character of his post in turning fisherman, merchant, vintner, and acting in the way of 1,000 meaner and more mechanical trades? Is not this a piece of tyranny, to force the inhabitants to buy what goods they want out of such and such a ship, and to sell their cod to such other ships as the governor is interested in, and that as a principal owner, to appropriate to himself the rigging and tackle of the ships that are cast away upon the coast, to stop the crew of merchantmen for his own fishery, to sell habitations or settlements, to stifle the bidding up for effects sold by way of auction, that he may engross them by his sole authority, to change the provisions laid up in magazines for his majesty's troops, to carry off the good biscuit and put bad in the room of it, to make so much beef and bacon for the subsistence of the garrison, to force the inhabitants to send their servants and carpenters to some work in which his majesty's service is less concerned than his own pocket. These, I say, are things that I take to be plain infractions of the orders issued forth by Louis XIV. These are abuses that must be redressed if we would have the king to be well served, and yet there's nothing done in it. For my part, I am unacquainted with the reason of the delay. Those that have a mind to know had best ask the deputies of Monsieur de P. I am fully persuaded that all these piracies do not come to the king's ear, for he is too just to suffer them. To conclude, Placentia bears neither corn, nor rye, nor peas, for the soil is good for nothing, not to mention that if it were as good and as fertile as any in Canada, yet nobody would give themselves the trouble to cultivate it, for one man earns more in cod fishing in one summer than 10 would do in the way of agriculture. In the great bay of Placentia there are some little harbors, besides that of the fort, which the Biscay fishermen resort to. Such are the Little and the Great Burin, St. Lawrence, Martyr, Chapeau Rouge, etc. A list of the savage nations of Canada, those in Acadia, the Abenakis, the Micmac, the Canibas, the Mahingans, the Openagos, the Sokokis, the Etchemens. These are all of them good warriors. They are more active and less cruel than the Iroquois. Their language differs a little from that of the Algonquins. The nations that lie upon the river of St. Lawrence from the sea to Montreal, the Papinachoes, the Mountaineers, the Gaspesians. These speak the Algonquin language. The Hurons of Loretto, the Iroquois tongue. The Abenakis of Sillery, the Algonquins, the Algonquin language. The Agnies of the Fall called Sault St. Louis. They speak the Iroquois language and are good warriors. The Iroquois of the Mountain of Montreal. They speak the Iroquois language and are a brave people. Those upon the Lake of Hurons. The Hurons, the Iroquois language. The Ottawas, the Knox, the Mississaugas, the Atikamekw, the Algonquin language. The Otehipoas, alias Sauteurs, good warriors. Upon the Illinois Lake and the adjacent country, some Illinois at Chicacou. The Omamis, good warriors. The Mascoutans, the Kikapos, good warriors. The Outagamis, good warriors. The Malomimis, the Ponteotamis, the Ohatinons, good warriors. The Sakis. They speak the Algonquin language and are a sprightly, active sort of people. In the neighborhood of the Lake of Frontenac, the Tzontonuans, the Goyagoans, the Onontague. These speak a different language from the Algonquin. The Onoyotes and Agnies at a small distance, near the river of the Ottawas. The Tabitibi, the Monsoni, the Machacandibi, the Nopemen of Achirini, the Nepisirini, the Teminskamink. They speak the Algonquin language, and all of them are very cowardly. To the north of Mississippi and upon the confines of the Upper Lake and Hudson's Bay, the Nadoweses, the Asimpools, the Saskatchewans, the Watbatons, the Atenons, the Clistinos brave warriors and active brisk men, the Eskimos. These speak Algonquin. A list of the animals of the south countries of Canada. Wild beavies, little stags or harts, roebucks of 3 different species, wolves such as we have in Europe, lynx such as we have in Europe, michibichi, a sort of bastard tiger, ferrets, weasels such as we have in Europe, ash-colored squirrels, hares, rabbits such as we have in Europe, badgers such as we have in Europe, wild beavies but very scarce, reddish bears, muskrats, reddish foxes as in Europe, crocodiles in the Mississippi, osa, an animal like a hare upon the Mississippi. A list of the animals of the north countries of Canada. Orignals or elks, caribou or wild asses, black foxes, silver-colored foxes, a sort of wildcats called Enfant du Diable, or the Devil's Children, carcayas, an animal not unlike a badger, porcupines, fontero, an amphibious sort of little polecats, martins, polecats, such as we have in Europe, black bears, white bears, siffleurs, an animal that makes a whizzing noise, flying squirrels, white hares, beavers, otters, muskrats, Swiss squirrels, or a sort of squirrels whose hair resembles a Swiss doublet, great harts, sea wolves or calves. A description of such animals or beasts as are not mentioned in the letters. The Mitsubishi is a sort of tiger, only 'tis less than the common tiger, and not so much speckled. As soon as it descries a man, it runs away, and climbs up the first tree it meets with. It attacks all brute animals whatsoever, and conquers them with ease. And, which is very singular and peculiar to it above all other animals, it runs in to the assistance of the savages, when they pursue bears and wild beavies. Upon such occasions it makes as it were afraid of nobody, and volleys out with fury upon the hunted animal. The savages call these animals a sort of Manitou, that is, spirits that love men, and 'tis upon that score they esteem and respect them to such a degree that they would choose rather to die than to kill one of them. The white beavers are much valued upon the account of their being uncommon, though at the same time their hair is neither so large nor so fine as that of the common beavers. So those which are quite black are very scarce. The reddish bears are mischievous creatures, for they fall fiercely upon the huntsman, whereas the black ones fly from them. The former sort are less and more nimble than the latter. The crocodiles of Mississippi are exactly the same with those of the Nile and other places. I have seen that crocodile that is at Engolisma in Aquitaine, and find that it has the same figure with these, only 'tis somewhat less. The most usual method that the savages have for taking them alive is to throw great wreaths or cords made of the barks of trees with a running knot upon their necks, the middle of their body, their paws, etc. After they are thus seized, they shut them up between 10 or 12 stakes, and there tie them after their belly is turned upwards. While they lie in this posture, they flea them without touching their head or their tail, and give them a coat of fir bark, to which they set fire, having cut the ropes that kept them fate. Upon such occasions, these animals make a fearful howling and crying. To conclude, the savages are frequently swallowed up by these creatures, whether in swimming over a river or in sleeping upon its banks. Aristotle, in the 68th diapason of his 15th song, gives this description of a crocodile. Vive sublito e dentro alla riviera, e i corpi umani son le sue vivande, delle persone misere e incaute, di viandanti e de infelice naute. That is, it lives both in the river and upon its banks. It squashes people with its murdering tooth. It feeds upon the bodies of poor travelers, of unfortunate passengers and sailors. The ossa are little animals like hares, and resemble them in everything except the ears and hind feet. They run and cannot climb. Their females have a bag under their belly, where their young ones enter upon a pursuit, in order to save themselves along with the mother, who immediately betakes herself to flight. The silver-colored foxes are of the same shape with those of Europe, as well as the black ones. The black ones are very scarce, and whosoever catches one is sure to sell it for its weight in gold. This species is met with only in the coldest countries. The white bears are a monstrous animal, and extraordinarily long. Their head has a formidable aspect, and their hair is very large and thick. They are so fierce that they'll come and attack a sloop in the sea with 7 or 8 men in it. 'Tis said that they'll swim 6 or 7 leagues without being tired. They live upon fish and shells upon the seashore, from whence they seldom straggle far. I never saw but one of them in my lifetime, which had certainly torn me to pieces if I had not spied it at a distance, and so had time to run back for shelter to Fort Lewis at Placentia. The flying squirrels are as big as a large rat, and of a grayish-white color. They are as drowsy as those of the other species are watchful. They are called flying squirrels in regard that they fly from one tree to another by the means of a certain skin which stretches itself out in the form of a wing when they make these little flights. The white hares are only such in winter. The white hares are only such in winter, for as soon as the spring comes on, they begin to turn grayish, and by degrees recover the same color as our hairs have in France, which they hold till the end of autumn. The Swiss squirrels are little animals resembling little rats. The epithet of Swiss is bestowed upon them in regard that the hair which covers their body is streaked with black and white, and resembles a Swiss doublet, and that these streaks make a ring on each thigh, which bears a great deal of resemblance to a Swiss's cap. The large stags are neither higher nor thicker than those we have in Europe, but they are called large in proportion to 2 other species of harts that frequent the southern countries. The lesser sort affords the most delicious meat. The sea wolves, which some call sea calves, are as big as mastiffs. They are almost always in the water, or at least they never go far from the seaside. These animals do not walk so much as they crawl, for when they raise themselves out of the water, they only creep upon the sand or clay. Their head has the form of an otter's head, and their feet, which have no legs, resemble those of a goose. The female kind bring forth their young ones upon the rocks, or upon some little islands just by the sea. The sea wolves live upon fish, and resort to cold countries. There's a prodigious number of them about the mouth of the river of St. Lawrence. As for the remaining animals of Canada, I give you an account of them in my letters. I will not offer to show you what methods the savages take to catch or kill all these animals, for such an undertaking would be endless. This I can assure you of in general, that they rarely go a-hunting to no purpose, and that they make no use of their dogs but in the hunting of elks, and sometimes in hunting of beavers, as you shall see under the head of the diversions of hunting and shooting among the savages. A list of fowl or birds that frequent the south countries of Canada. Vultures, whards, a river fowl as big as a goose, swans, black geese, black ducks, plungeons, coots, such as we have in Europe, rails, turkeys, red partridges, pheasants, large eagles, cranes, blackbirds, thrushes, such as we have in Europe, wood pigeons, parrots, ravens, swallows, such as we have in Europe. Several sorts of birds of prey that are not known in Europe. Nightingales, unknown in Europe, as well as several other little birds of different colors, particularly that called owasso mouche, a very little bird resembling a fly, and great quantities of pelicans. The birds of the north countries of Canada. Bustards, white geese, such as we have in Europe. Ducks of 10 or 12 sorts. Teals, seamews, grellands, stertlets, sea parrots, moyaks, cormorants, heathcocks, snipes, plungeons, plovers, lapwings, herns, corbeas, the waterfowl called chevalier, such as we have in Europe, batours the foe, a fowl as big as a quail, white partridges, large black partridges, reddish partridges, woodhens, turtle doves, white ortolans, a bird no bigger than a lark, sterlings, ravens, such as we have in Europe, vultures, sparhawks, merlins, swallows, like ours in Europe, becs the sigh, a sort of a duck. A table of the insects that are found in Canada: adders, asps, rattlesnakes, lowing frogs, gnats or midges, gadbees, brulots or burning handworms. A description of such birds as are not accounted for in my letters. The whards are a freshwater fowl as big as a goose and as dull and heavy as an ass. They have black and white feathers, a pointed beak, and a very short neck. They only duck or dive in the summer, for they cannot use their wings. And in that season, the savages take the diversion of surrounding them with 7 or 8 canoes, dispersed here and there, and so obliging them to dive down when they offered to come up to take breath. The savages have entertained me several times with this agreeable amusement during the course of the voyages I made with them. The red partridges are wild and little, and much different from the red partridge we have in Europe, as well as the pheasant, whose feathers, being of a white color with black specks, make a very agreeable diversity. The largest eagles we find in this country are no bigger than swans. Their head and their tail is white, and they have frequent engagements with a sort of vultures that commonly have the better of it. In our voyages we had frequent occasions of seeing these engagements, which last as long as the eagle can keep up the force of its wings. The parrots are met with in the Illinois country and upon the river of Mississippi. They are very small and are the same with those that we bring from Brazil and Cayenne. That sort of nightingale that I saw is of a peculiar form, for 'tis of a lesser size than the European, and of a bluish color, and its notes are more diversified. Besides that, it lodges in the holes of trees, and 4 or 5 of them do commonly keep together upon the thickest trees, and with joint notes warble o'er their songs. The fly-like bird is no bigger than one's thumb, and the color of its feathers is so changeable that 'tis hard to fasten any one color upon it. They appear sometimes red, sometimes of a gold color, and other times they are blue and red. And properly speaking, 'tis only the brightest of the sun that makes us unsensible of the change of its gold and red colors. Its beak is as sharp as a needle. It flies from flower to flower like a bee, and by its fluttering sucks the flowery sap. Sometimes about noon, it perches upon the little branches of plum trees or cherry trees. I have sent some of them dead to France, it being impossible to keep them alive, and they were looked upon as a great curiosity. There are 10 or 12 sorts of ducks in this country. Those called brancas are the smallest indeed, but they are much the prettiest. The feathers upon their neck look so bright, by virtue of the variety of liveliness of their colors, and a fur of that nature would be invaluable in Muscovy or Turkey. They owe the name of brancas to their resting upon the branches of trees. There is another species of ducks in this country that are as black as jackdaws. Only their beak and the circle of their eyes are red. The seamews, grelins, and sturtlets are fowls that fly incessantly over seas, lakes, and rivers in order to catch little fish. Their flesh is good for nothing. Besides that, they have no substance of body, though they seem to be as big as pigeons. The sea parrots bear the name of parrots upon the account that their beak is of the same form with that of the land parrot. They never quit the sea or the shore, and are always flying upon the surface of the water in quest of little fish. Their color is black, and their size is much the same with that of a pullet. There are great numbers of them upon the bank of Newfoundland and near the coast of the island, which the seamen catch with hooks covered with a cod's roe and hung over the prow of the ship. The moyaks are a sort of fowl, as big as a goose, having a short neck and a broad foot, and which is very strange. Their eggs are half as big again as a swan's, and yet they are all yelk, and that so thick that they must be diluted with water before they can be used in pancakes. The white partridges are as big as our red partridges. Their feet are covered with such a thick down that they resemble those of a young rabbit. They are only seen in the winter time, and some years they are scarce seen at all, though on the other hand in other years they are so plentiful that you may buy a dozen for 9 pence. This is the most stupid animal in the world. It sits upon the snow and suffers itself to be knocked on the head with a pole without offering to stir. I am of the opinion that this unaccountable numbness is occasioned by its long flight from Greenland to Canada. This conjecture is not altogether groundless, for 'tis observed that they never come in flocks to Canada, but after the long continuance of a north or a northeast wind. The black partridges are truly very pretty. They are bigger than ours, and their beak together with the circle of the eyes and the feet are red, their plumage being of a shining black color. These animals are very proud, and seem to have a sense of their beauty as they walk. They are but very uncommon, as well as the reddish partridges, which resemble quails in their bulk and briskness. The white ortolans are only met with in winter, but I am of the opinion that their feathers are naturally of a white color, and that they retrieve their natural color in the places they are retired to when they disappear in Canada. They are indifferent good to eat when they are fat, but that they seldom are. In the winter, great quantities of them are catched about the barns, with nets stretched out upon the straw. A description of the insects of Canada. The adders of Canada do no harm at all. The asps indeed are very dangerous when the people bathe in the stagnating water towards the south countries. The rattlesnake or sounding serpent is so called in regard that the extremity of its tail, it has a sort of a case containing certain bones which make such a noise when the serpent creeps along, that 'tis heard 30 paces off. These serpents betake themselves to flight when they hear the sound of men's feet, and commonly sleep in the sun either in green fields or open woods. They never sting but when they are trod upon. The low-winged frogs are so called with respect to their croaking, which sounds like the lowing of an ox. These frogs are twice as large as those we have in Europe. The Canada gad bees are a sort of flies about twice as big as bees, but of the same form with a common fly. They sting only between noon and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but then they do it so violently that they fetch blood. However, 'tis only upon certain rivers that they are met with. The brulots are a sort of handworms, which cleave so hard to the skin that their pricking occasions the same sense as if 'twere a burning coal or a spark of fire. These little animals are unperceivable, though at the same time they are pretty numerous. The names of the fish in the river of St. Lawrence, from its mouth to the lakes of Canada. Balenots, or little whales, a fish almost as big as a whale called souffleur. White porpoises, salmon, such as we have in Europe, eels, mackerel, as in Europe, herrings, gasperods, a small fish like a herring, bases, shadfish, codfish, plaices, smelts, turbots, pikes, the gold-colored fish, roaches, lampreys, merles or sea tench, thornbacks, congers, sea cows, a kind of porpoises, the shellfish, little lobsters, crabfish, cockles, mussels, the fish that are found in the lakes of Canada and in the rivers that fall into them, sturgeons, the armed fish, trouts, whitefish, a sort of herrings, eels, mullets, carp, goldfish, gudgeons, the fish found in the river of Mississippi, pikes, such as we have in Europe, carps, tench, perches, dabs, and several others that are not known in Europe. A description of the fish that are not mentioned in the letters. The bale knot is a sort of a whale, only 'tis less and more fleshy, and does not yield oil in proportion to the northern whales. This fish goes 50 or 60 leagues up the river. The souffleurs are much of the same size, only they are shorter and blacker. When they mean to take breath after diving, they squirt out of the water through a hole behind their head, after the same manner with the whales. Commonly, they dog the ships in the river of St. Lawrence. The white porpoises are as big as oxen. They always go along with the current, and go up with the tide till they come at fresh water, upon which they retire with the ebb water. They are a ghastly sort of animals, and are frequently taken before Quebec. The gasperod are a small fish, not unlike a herring. In the summertime, they make into the shore, in such shoals that the codfishers take as many of them as serves for bait for that fishery. These fishermen do likewise make use of herrings when the season obliges them to put into the shore to spawn. In a word, all the fish that are made use of for a bait to make the codfish bite at the hook are called boete in the fisherman's dialect. The gold-colored fish are nice food. They are about 15 inches long, their scales are yellow, and they are valued very high. The sea cows, which are a sort of porpoises, are bigger than the Normandy beavies. They have a sort of paws cut like a goose's foot. Their head resembles that of an otter, and their teeth, which are 2 inches thick and 9 inches long, are reckoned the finest ivory that is. 'Tis said that they range wide off the shore, towards sandy and marshy places. The lobsters of this river seem to be exactly the same with those we have in Europe. The cockles are of a piece with those we have upon the coast of France, excepting that they are larger and have a more agreeable taste, though their flesh seems to partake more of crudity and indigestion. The mussels of this river are prodigiously large and taste very well, but 'tis next to an impossibility to eat them without breaking one's teeth, by reason of their being stuffed with pearl. I call it pearl, though the name of gravel or sand may be more proper, with respect to its value, for I brought to Paris 50 or 60 of the largest and finest, which were rated only at a penny apiece, notwithstanding that we had broke above 2,000 mussels to make up that number. The lake sturgeons are commonly 5 or 6 foot long, but I once saw one of 10 foot and another of 12 in length. The savages catch them with nets in the winter and grapples in the summer. 'Tis said they have a certain sort of flesh about their head that tastes like beef, mutton, and veal, but I have eat of it several times, and never could observe any such thing, which makes me look upon the allegation as chimerical. The fish in armor is about 3 foot and a half long. 'Tis defended by such strong and hard scales that 'tis impossible for any other fish to hurt it. Its enemies are trouts and roaches, but 'tis admirably well provided for the repulsing of their attacks, by virtue of its pointed snout, which is a foot long and as hard as its skin. It eats very well, and its flesh or substance is as firm as 'tis white. The lake dabs, or sandings, are not above a foot long, but they are very thick all over. They are called barbus in French, with allusion to a certain sort of beards that hang down from the side of their muzzle, and are as big as ears of corn. Those which we find in the river of Mississippi are of a monstrous size. Both the one and the other are catched with a hook, as well as with a net, and make very good victuals. The Mississippi carps are likewise of an extraordinary size, and admirably well tasted. They are of the same form with ours. In the autumn they put in towards the shore, and are easily catched with a net. The largest trouts we meet with in the lakes are 5.5 feet long, and of 1 foot diameter. Their flesh is red, and they are catched with great hooks made fast to pieces of wire. The fish catched in the lakes are better than those we take at sea or in the rivers, particularly the whitefish, which for goodness and nice eating are far beyond all the other species. The savages that live upon the sides of those little freshwater seas prefer the broth of fish to meat broth when they are indisposed. This choice they ground upon experience, whereas the French, on the other hand, find that venison broth is at once more substantial and restorative. The rivers of Canada are replenished with an infinity of other fishes that are not known in Europe. The fish catched in the North Country rivers are different from those of the South, and those taken in the Long River, which disembourges into the river of Mississippi, savor so rank of mud and clay that 'tis impossible to eat of them, abating for a sort of little trouts that the savages take in the adjacent lakes, which make a tolerable mess. The rivers of the Ottentats and the Missouris produce such odd-shaped fishes that 'tis impossible to describe them without they were drawn upon paper. These fishes tastes but sorely, and yet the savages love it mightily, which I take to proceed from their knowing no better. The trees and fruits of the south countries of Canada. Beech trees, red oak, such as we have in Europe, bitter cherry trees, maple trees, ash trees, elms, linden trees, such as we have in Europe, nut trees of 2 sorts, chestnut trees, apple trees, pear trees, plum trees, cherry trees, hazel trees, such as we have in Europe, vines, a sort of citrons, watermelons, sweet citruls, wild gooseberries, pineapples, tobacco, such as our Spanish tobacco, the trees and fruits of the north countries of Canada, white oak, red oak, birch trees, bitter cherry trees, maple trees, pine trees, epinets, fir trees of 3 sorts, peruses, cedar trees, aspen trees, whitewood, adler trees, maidenhair, strawberries, raspberries, gooseberries, bluets. A description of the above-mentioned trees and fruits. You must remark that all the wood of Canada is good of its kind. The trees that stand exposed to the north winds are apt to be influenced by the frost, as it appears from the chops and chinks that it occasions. The bitter cherry tree has a hard and whitish wood, with a grey bark. Some of them are as tall as the loftiest oaks, and as big as a hogshead. This tree grows straight, and has an oval leaf, and is made use of in beams, rafters, and other carpenter's work. The maple tree is much of the same height and bulk, but it has a brown bark, and the wood is reddish. It bears no resemblance to that sort we have in Europe. It yields a sap, which has a much pleasanter taste than the best lemonade or cherry water, and makes the wholesomest drink in the world. This liquor is drawn by cutting the tree 2 inches deep in the wood, the cut being run slopping to the length of 10 or 12 inches. At the lower end of this gash, a knife is thrust into the tree sloppingly, so that the water running along the cut or gash as through a gutter, and falling upon the knife that lies across the channel, runs out upon the knife, which has vessels placed underneath to receive it. Some trees will yield 5 or 6 bottles of this water a day, and some inhabitants of Canada might draw 20 hogsheads of it in one day, if they would thus cut and notch all the maples of their respective plantations. The gash does no harm to the tree. Of this sap they make sugar and syrup, which is so valuable that there can't be a better remedy for fortifying the stomach. 'Tis but a few of the inhabitants that have the patience to make maple water, for as common and usual things are always slighted, so there's scarce anybody but children that give themselves the trouble of gathering these trees. To conclude, the North Country maples have more sap than those of the South Countries, but at the same time the sap is not so sweet. There are two sorts of nut trees in this country. The one bears round and the other long nuts, but neither of them is good for anything, no more than the wild chestnuts that grow in the Illinois country. The apples that grow upon some of their apple trees eat well when they are cuddled, but they are good for nothing when they're raw. Upon the Mississippi, indeed, there's a sort of apples that have a taste not unlike that of some European apples. The pears are good, but very scarce. The cherries are small and extreme red, and though their taste is not good, yet the roebucks like them so well that in the summertime they scarce ever miss to lie under the cherry trees all night long, especially if it blows hard. This country affords three sorts of excellent plums, which bear no resemblance to ours either in figure or color. Some are long and small, some are round and thick, and some very little. The vines twine round the tree to the very top, and the branches of those trees are so covered with grapes that one would take the grape to be the fruit of the tree. In some countries of North America, the grape is little, but very well tasted, but towards the Mississippi 'tis long and thick, and so is the custard. There has been some wine pressed from the grapes of that country, which after long standing became as sweet as canary, and as black as ink. The citrons of North America are so called only because their form resembles that of our citron. Instead of a rind, they have only a single skin. They grow upon a plant that rises 3 foot high and does not bear above 3 or 4 at a time. This fruit is as wholesome as its root is dangerous, for the one is very healthy, and the juice of the other is a more subtle poison. While I stayed at Fort Frontenac in the year 1684, I saw an Iroquois woman take down this fatal potion with a design to follow her deceased husband. After she had took leave of her friends and sung the death song, with the formalities that are usual among these blind wretches, the poison quickly worked the desired effect for this widow, who in Europe would be justly looked upon as a miracle of constancy and fidelity, had no sooner swallowed the murdering juice than she fell into 2 or 3 shivering fits, and so expired. The watermelons, called by the Spaniards Algiers melons, are round and thick like a ball. Some are red and some white, and the kernels, which are very large, are sometimes black, sometimes red. As for their taste, 'tis exactly the same with that of the Spanish or Portuguese melons. The citrons of this country are sweet, and of a different nature from those of Europe, and I'm informed that the American citrons will not grow in Europe. They are as big as our melons, and their pulp is as yellow as saffron. Commonly they are baked in ovens, but the better way is to roast them under the embers as the savages do. Their taste is much the same with that of the marmalade of apples, only they are sweeter. One may eat as much of them as he pleases, without fearing any disorder from them. The wild gooseberries are good for nothing, but for confits. But that sort of confits are seldom made, for sugar is too dear in Canada to be employed for such uses. A description of the trees and fruits of the northern countries. The Canada birch trees are much different from those we have in some provinces of France, both for bulk and quality. The savages make canoes of their bark, some of which is red and some white, but both are equally proper for that use. That which has the fewest veins and chops is the best, but the red bark makes the finest show. There are some little baskets made of the young birches that are much esteemed in France, and books may be made of them, the leaves of which will be as fine as paper. This I can speak by experience, for I have frequently made use of them for want of paper in writing the journal of my voyages. Nay, I remember I have seen in a certain library in France a manuscript of the Gospel of St. Matthew, written in Greek upon this sort of bark. And, which is yet more surprising, I was then told that it had been written above 1,000 years, and at the same time I dare swear that 'twas the genuine birch bark of New France, which in all appearance was not then discovered. The pine trees are very tall, straight and thick, and are made use of for masts, which the king's pinks do oftentimes transport to France. 'Tis said that some of these trees are big enough to serve for a mast to a first-rate ship. The epinet is a sort of a pine with a sharper and thicker leaf. 'Tis made use of in carpenter's work, and the matter which drains from it smells as sweet as incense. There are 3 sorts of firs in this country, which are sawed into dales by certain mills that the Quebec merchants have caused to be built in some places. The Perouse is the properest of all green woods for the building of ships, upon the consideration that 'tis compacter and has closer pores, so that it does not soak or drink in the moisture as much as others. Here are 2 sorts of cedar, namely the white and the red, but one must view 'em narrowly before he can distinguish 'em, by reason that both of 'em have much the same sort of bark. These trees are low, bushy, and full of branches and little leaves, resembling the tag of a lace. The wood of this tree is almost as light as cork, and the savages make use of it in the wreaths and ribs of their canoes. The red sort looks admirably well, and may be made into household goods, which will retain an agreeable smell forever. The asps are little shrubs, which grow upon the sides of pools or rivers, and, in a word, in moist and marshy countries. This wood is the common food of the beavers, who, in imitation of the ants, take care to make a collection of it round their huts in the autumn, which serves them for subsistence when the ice imprisons them in winter. The white wood is a middling sort of tree, that's neither too big nor too little. 'Tis almost as light as cedar, and as easily worked upon. The inhabitants of Canada make little canoes of it, for fishing and crossing the rivers. Maidenhair is as common in the forests of Canada as fern is in those of France, and is esteemed beyond that of other countries, insomuch that the inhabitants of Quebec prepare great quantities of its syrup, which they send to Paris, Nantes, Rouen, and several other cities in France. Strawberries and raspberries are wonderfully plentiful in Canada, and taste extreme well. We meet likewise with some white gooseberries in this country, but they serve for no use, unless it be to make a sort of vinegar of them, that is very strong. The bluets are certain little berries, not unlike small cherries, only they are black and perfectly round. The plant upon which they grow is as big as a raspberry bush. These berries serve for several uses, after they are dried in the sun or in an oven, for then they make confits of them, or put them into pyres, or infuse them in brandy. The North Country savages make a crop of them in the summer, which affords them very seasonable relief, especially when their hunting comes short. A general view of the commerce of Canada. I come now to give a brief and general account of the commerce of Canada, which I have already touched upon in my letters. The Normans were the first that set up this trade, and usually they set out from Havre de Grace or Dieppe, but the Rochellers have now worked them out of it, for as much as the Rochelle ships furnish the inhabitants of that continent with the necessary commodities. There are likewise some ships sent to Canada from Bordeaux and Bayonne, with wines, brandy, tobacco, and iron. The ships bound from France to that country pay no custom for their cargo, whether in clearing in France or in their entries at Quebec, abating for the Brazil tobacco, which pays 5 sols a pound. That is to say, a roll of 400-pound weight pays 100 livres by way of entry to the office of the Farmers General. Most of the ships go laden to Canada and return light or empty. Some indeed bring home peace when they are good cheap in the colony, and others take in a cargo of planks and boards. Others again go to the island of Cape Breton, and there take in a cargo of pit coal, which they carry to the islands of Martinique or Guadalupe, where the refining of sugars occasions a great consumption of coals. But those ships which either belong or are recommended to the topping merchants of the colony are fraughted with skins, which turns to a great account. I have seen some ships unload at Quebec and then steer to Placentia, to take in codfish, which they purchased with ready money. But generally speaking, there's more lost than got by that way of trading. The merchant that has carried on the greatest trade in Canada is the Sieur Samuel Bernon of Rochelle, who has great warehouses at Quebec, from which the inhabitants of the other towns are supplied with such commodities as they want. 'Tis true, there are some merchants at Quebec who are indifferent rich, and fit out ships upon their own bottom, that ply to and again between France and Canada, and these merchants have their correspondents at Rochelle, who send out and take in every year the cargoes of their ships. There's no difference between the pirates that scour the seas and the Canada merchants, unless it be this, that the former sometimes enrich themselves all of a sudden by a good price, and that the latter can't make their fortune without trading for 5 or 6 years, and that without running the hazard of their lives. I have known 20 little peddlers that had not above 1,000 crowns stock when I arrived at Quebec in the year 1683, and when I left that place had got to the tune of 12,000 crowns. 'Tis an unquestioned truth that they get 50% upon all the goods they deal in, whether they buy 'em up upon the arrival of the ships at Quebec or have 'em from France by way of commission. But over and above that, there are some little gaudy trinkets, such as ribands, laces, embroideries, tobacco boxes, watches, and an infinity of other baubles of ironware, upon which they get 150%, all costs clear. In this country, a hogshead of Bordeaux wine, which contains 250 bottles, is worth about 40 French livres in time of peace and 60 in time of war. A hogshead of Nantes or Bayonne brandy will fetch 80 or 100 livres. In the taverns, a bottle of wine costs 6 French sous, and a bottle of brandy is sold for 20. As for dry commodities, their price rises and falls upon occasion. Brazil tobacco is worth 40 sous a pound by way of retail, and 35 by wholesale. Sugar will fetch at least 20 sous a pound, and sometimes 25 or 30. The earliest ships that come from France set out commonly in the latter end of April, or the beginning of May, but to my mind they might shorten their voyage by 1/2 if they put to sea about the middle of March, and then swept along the north coast of the Azores Islands. For in those seas the south and southeast winds commonly blow from the beginning of April to the end of May. I have mentioned this several times to the most expert pilots, but they still put me off with the plea that they dare not steer the course for fear of some rocks, and yet these rocks are not to be met with but in their charts. I have read some descriptions of the ports, roads, and coasts of these islands and the adjacent seas done by the Portuguese, which make no mention of the shelves that are chalked down in all our charts. On the contrary, they affirm that the coast of these islands is altogether clear, and that for 20 leagues off into the main, these imaginary rocks were never met with. As soon as the French ships arrive at Quebec, the merchants of that city who have their factors in other towns load their barks with goods in order to transport them to these other towns. Such merchants as act for themselves at Trois-Rivières or Montreal, they come down in person to Quebec to market for themselves, and then put their effects on board of barks to be conveyed home. If they pay for their goods in skins, they buy cheaper than if they made their payments in money or letters of exchange, by reason that the seller gets considerably by the skins when he returns to France. Now you must take notice that all these skins are bought up from the inhabitants or from the savages, upon which the merchants are considerable gainers. To give you an instance of this matter, a person that lives in the neighborhood of Quebec carries a dozen of marten skins, 5 or 6 foxes' skins, and as many skins of wildcats to a merchant's house, in order to sell them for woolen cloth, linen, arms, ammunition, etc. In the truck of these skins, the merchant draws a double profit, one upon the score of his paying no more for the skins than 1/2 what he afterward sells them for in the lump to the factors for the Rochelle ships, and the other by the exorbitant rate he puts upon the goods that the poor planter takes in exchange for his skins. If this be duly weighed, we will not think it strange that these merchants have a more beneficial trade than a great many other tradesmen in the world. In my 7th and 8th letter, I related the particulars of the commerce of this country, especially that which the inhabitants carry on with the savages, who supply him with the skins of beavers and other animals, so that now it remains only to give you an inventory of the goods that are proper for the savages, and of the skins which they give in exchange together with their neat prices. Short and light fuses, powder, ball and cut lead, or small shot, axes both great and small, knives with their sheaths, sword blades to make darts of, kettles of all sizes, shoemakers' awls, fish hooks of all sizes, flintstones, caps of blue serge, shirts made of the common Brittany linen, woolsted stockings, short and coarse, Brazil tobacco, coarse white thread for nets, sewing thread of several colors, pack thread, vermilion, needles, both large and small, Venice beads, some iron heads for arrows, but few of them, a small quantity of soap, a few sabers or cutlasses. Brandy goes off incomparably well. The names of the skins given in exchange with their rates. The skins of winter beavers, alias Muscovy beavers, are worth per pound in the farmer's general's warehouse, 4 livres, 10 sous. The skin of fat beavers, the hair of which falls off while the savages make use of them, per pound, 5 livres. Of beavers taken in autumn, per pound, 3 livres, 10 sous. Of dry or common beavers, per pound, 3 livres. Of summer beavers, per pound, 3 livres. The skin of a white beaver is not to be valued, no more than that of a fox that's quite black. The skins of silver-colored foxes apiece, 4 livres. Of common foxes in good order, 2 livres. Of the common martins, 1 livre. Of the prettiest sort of martins, 4 livres. Of red and smooth otters, 2 livres. Of the winter and brown otters, 4 livres, 10 sous, or more. Of the finest black bears, 7 livres. The skins of elks before they're dressed are worth per pound about 12 sous. The skins of stags are worth per pound about 8 sous. The wildcats or enfants de diable apiece, 1 livre 15 sous. Sea wolves apiece, 1 livre 15 sous or more. Polecats and weasels, 10 sous. Muskrats, 6 sous. Their testicles, 5 sous. Wolves, 2 livres 10 sous. The white elk skins, i.e. those dressed by the savages, apiece, 8 livres or more. A dressed hart skin is worth 5 livres or more. A caribou, 6 livres. A roebuck's, 3 livres. To conclude, you must take notice that these skins are upon some particular occasions dearer than I rate them, but the difference is but very small, whether under or over. An account of the government of Canada in general. In Canada, the politic, civil, ecclesiastical, and military government are all in a manner one thing, in regard that the wisest governors have subjected their authority to that of the ecclesiastics, and such governors as would not embark in that interest have found their posts so uneasy that they have been recalled with disgrace. I could instance in several, who for not adhering to the sentiments of the bishop and the Jesuits, and for refusing to lodge their power in the hands of these infallible gentlemen, have been turned out and treated at court like hot-headed incendiaries. Mr. de Frontenac was one of this number, who made such an unhappy exit, for he fell out with Mr. Duchesneau, intendant of that country, who finding himself protected by the clergy, industriously insulted that illustrious general, and the general was forced to give way under the weight of an ecclesiastical league by reason of the springs they set at work against him, in opposition to all the principles of honor and conscience. The governor-general that means to neglect no opportunity of advancing or enriching themselves do commonly hear 2 masses a day, and are obliged to confess 1 in 24 hours. He has always clergymen hanging about him wherever he goes, and indeed, properly speaking, they are his counselors. When a governor is thus backed by the clergy, the intendants, the under-governors, and the sovereign council, dares not censure his conduct, let it be never so faulty, for the protection of the ecclesiastics, shelters him from all the charges that can be laid against him. The Governor General of Quebec has 20,000 crowns a year, including the pay of his company of guards and the particular government of the fort. Over and above this income, the farmers of the beaver skins make him a present of 1,000 crowns a year. His wines and all his other provisions imported from France pay no freight, not to mention that by certain ways and means he sucks as much money out of the country as all the above mentioned articles amount to. The intendant has 18,000 livres a year, but the Lord knows what he makes otherwise. I have no mind to touch there, for fear of being ranked among those detractors who speak the truth too sincerely. The bishop's incomes are so small that if the king were not graciously pleased to add to his bishopric some other benefices in France, that reverend prelate would be reduced to as short commons as 100 of his character are in the kingdom of Naples. The major of Quebec has 600 crowns a year, the governor of Trois-Rivières has 1,000, and the governor of Montreal is allowed 2,000. A captain has 120 livres a month, a lieutenant 90 livres, a reformed lieutenant is allowed but 40, and a common soldier's pay is 6 sous a day of the current money of the country. The people repose a great deal of confidence in the clergy in this country as well as elsewhere. Here the outward show of devotion is strictly observed, for the people dare not absent from the great masses and sermons without a lawful excuse. But after all, 'tis at the time of divine service that the married women and maids give their humors a full loose, as being assured that their husbands and mothers are busy at church. The priests call people by their names in the pulpit. They prohibit under the pain of excommunication the reading of romances and plays, as well as the use of masks and playing at ombre or lansquenet. The Jesuits and the Recollets agree as ill as the Molinists and the Jansenists. The former pretend that the latter have no right to confess. Do but look back to my 8th letter, and there you'll see some instances of the indiscreet zeal of the ecclesiastics. The Governor General has the disposal of all military posts. He bestows companies, lieutenancies, and under-lieutenancies upon who he pleases, with His Majesty's gracious approbation, but he is not allowed to dispose of particular governorships, or of the place of a Lord Lieutenant of a province, or of the major of any town. He is empowered to grant to the gentry and the other inhabitants lands and settlements all over Canada, but these grants must be given in concert with the intendant. He is likewise authorized to give 5 and 20 licenses a year to whom he thinks fit for trading with the savage nations of that vast continent. He is invested with the power of suspending the execution of sentences against criminals, and by virtue of this reprieve can easily procure him a pardon if he has a mind to favor him. But he can't dispose of the king's money without the consent of the intendant, who is the only man that can call it out of the hands of the treasurer of the navy. The Governor General can't be without the service of the Jesuits in making treaties with the governors of New England and New York, as well as with the Iroquois. I am at a loss to know whether these good fathers are employed in such services upon the score of their judicious counsels, and their being perfectly well acquainted with the country and the king's true interests, or upon the consideration of their speaking to a miracle the languages of so many different nations whose interests are quite opposite, or out of a sense of that condescension and submission that is due to these worthy companions of our Savior. The members of the Supreme Council of Canada can't sell or convey their places to their heirs or to anybody else without the king's approbation, though at the same time their places may be worth not so much as the place of a lieutenant to a company of foot. When they have nice points under their consideration, they usually consult the priests or Jesuits, and if any cause comes before them in which these good fathers are interested, they are sure not to be cast, unless it be so very black that the cunningest lawyer can't give it a plausible turn. I've been informed by several persons that the Jesuits drive a great trade in European commodities and Canada skins, but I can scarce believe it, or at least if it be so, they must have correspondents and factors that are as close and cunning as themselves, which can never be. The gentlemen of that country are obliged to be very cautious in carrying even with the ecclesiastics, in respect of the good or harm that the good fathers can indirectly throw in their way. The bishop and the Jesuits have such an influence over the governors general as is sufficient to procure places to the children of the noblemen or gentlemen that are devoted to their service, or to obtain the licenses that I spoke of in my 8th letter. 'Tis likewise in their power to serve the daughters of such gentlemen by finding them agreeable and rich husbands. The meanest curates must be managed cautiously, for they can either serve or deserve the gentlemen, in whose signories they are no more than missionaries, there being no fixed cures in Canada, which indeed is a grievance that ought to be redressed. The officers of the army are likewise obliged to keep up a good correspondence with the ecclesiastics, for without that 'tis impossible for them to keep their ground. They must not only take care that their own conduct be regular, but likewise look after that of the soldiers, by preventing the disorders they might commit in their quarters. Commonly the troops are quartered upon the inhabitants of the Cots, or signories of Canada, from October to May. The master of the house furnishes his military guests only with utensils, and employs him all the while at the rate of 10 sous a day, besides his victuals, in the cutting of wood, grubbing up of grounds, rooting out stumps, or the threshing of corn in a barn. The captain gets likewise by their work, for to make them discount the half of their pay to him, he orders them to come thrice a week to exercise their arms at his quarters. Now, their habitations being distant 4 or 5 arpents from one another, and one cut or signory being 2 or 3 leagues in front, the soldiers choose rather to give the captain a spill than to walk so far in the snow and the dirt, and the captain takes it very conscientiously, upon the plea that volenti non fit injuria. As for such soldiers as are good tradesmen, he's sure of putting their whole pay in his pocket, by virtue of a license that he gives them to work in the towns, or anywhere else. In fine, most of the officers marry in this country, but God knows what sort of marriages they make, in taking girls with a dowry consisting of 11 crowns, a cock, a hen, an ox, a cow, and sometimes a calf. I knew several young women, whose lovers, after denying the fact, and proving before the judges the scandalous conversation of their mistresses, were forced upon the persuasion of the ecclesiastics to swallow the bitter pill and take the very same girls in marriage. Some officers indeed marry well, but there are few such. The occasion of their marrying so readily in that country proceeds from the difficulty of conversing with the soft sex. After a man has made 4 visits to a young woman, he is obliged to unfold his mind to her father and mother. He must then either talk of marriage or break off all correspondence. Or if he does not, both he and she lies under a scandal. In this country, a man can't visit another man's wife without being censured, as if her husband was a cuckold. In fine, a man can meet with no diversion here, but that of reading or eating or drinking. Though after all, there are some intrigues carried on, but with the same caution as in Spain, where the virtue of the ladies consists only in disguising the matter handsomely. Now that I am upon the subject of marriage, I can't forbear to acquaint you with a comical adventure that happened to a young captain who was pressed to marry against his will because all his companions and acquaintances were already buckled. This young officer, having made some visits to a councillor's daughter, he was desired to tell what errand he came upon, and Mr. de Frontenac himself being related to the young lady, who is certainly one of the most accomplished ladies of this age, used his utmost efforts to engage the captain to marry her. The captain being equally well pleased with a free access to the governor's stable and the company of the lady whom he met there not unfrequently. The captain, I say, being equally fond of these 2 advantages, endeavored to ward off the design by asking some time to consider of it. Accordingly, 2 months were granted him, and after that time was expired, he had still a mind to let out his traces, and so desired 2 months more, which were granted him by the bishop's intercession. When the last of these 2 was at an end, the cavalier began to be apprehensive that he was in danger of losing both his good cheer and the agreeable company of the lady. However, he was obliged to be present at a treat that Mr. Nelson, the English gentleman I spoke of in my 23rd letter, gave to the 2 lovers, as well as the governor, the intendant, the bishop, and some other persons of note. And this generous English gentleman, having a kindness for the young lady's father and her brethren, upon the score of their trading with one another, made an offer of 1,000 crowns to be paid on the wedding day, which added to 1,000 that the bishop offered, and 1,000 more which she had of her own, besides 7,000 or 8,000 that Mr. de Frontenac offered in licenses, not to mention the certain prospect of preferment. All these items, I say, made the marriage very advantageous to the captain. After they had done eating, he was pressed to sign the contract, but made answer that he had drunk some bumpers of heavy wine, and his head was not clear enough for weighing the conditions of the contract, so that they were forced to put off the matter till the next day. Upon this delay, he kept his chamber till Mr. de Frontenac, at whose table he used to eat, sent for him in order to know his mind immediately. Then there was no room left for shuffling. There was a necessity of giving a positive answer to the governor, who spoke to him in plain and precise terms, and at the same time reminded him of the favor they had shown him in allowing him so much time to consider of the proposed marriage. The young officer replied very fairly that any man that was capable of marrying after 4 months' deliberation was a fool in buckling to. "I now see," says he, "what I am. The eager desire I had of going to church with Mademoiselle D has now convinced me of my folly. If you have a respect for the lady, pray do not suffer her to marry a young spark that is so apt to take up with extravagant and foolish things. As for my own part, sir, I protest sincerely that the little reason and free judgment that is left me will serve to comfort me upon the loss of her, and to teach me to repent of having desired to make her as unhappy as myself." This discourse surprised the bishop, the governor, the intendant, and in general all the other married officers, who desired nothing more than that he should be catched in the news as well as they. So true it is, that solamen miseris socios abuis doloris. As they were far from expecting any such retraction, so the poor reformed captain suffered for it. For some time after, Mr. de Frontenac did him a piece of injustice in bestowing a vacant company over his head upon Madame de Pontchartrain's nephew, notwithstanding that the court had sent orders on his behalf, and this obliged them to go to France along with me in the year 1692. To resume the thread of my discourse, you must know that the Canadese or Creoles are a robust, brawny, well-made people. They are strong, vigorous, active, brave, and indefatigable. In a word, they want nothing but the knowledge of polite letters. They are presumptuous and very full of themselves. They value themselves beyond all the nations of the earth, and, which is to be regretted, they have not that veneration for their parents that is due. Their complexion is wonderfully pretty. The women are generally handsome. Few of them are brown, but many of them are at once wise and lazy. They love luxury to the last degree, and strive to outdo one another in catching husbands in the trap. There's an infinity of disorders in Canada that want to be reformed. The first step of a true reformation must be that of hindering the ecclesiastics to visit the inhabitants so often, and to pry with such impertinence into the minutest affairs of the family, for such practices are frequently contrary to the good of society, and that for reasons that you are not ignorant of. The next thing to be done is to prohibit the officers to stop the soldiers' pay, and to enjoin them to discipline their men every holiday and every Sunday. In the third place, the commodities ought to be rated at a reasonable price, so that the merchant may have his profit without exacting upon the inhabitants and savages. A fourth article of reformation would consist in prohibiting the exporting from France to Canada of brocados, gold and silver galloons or ribbons, and rich laces. In a fifth place, the Governor-General ought not to sell licenses for trading with the savages of the Great Lakes. Sixthly, there ought to be fixed courts. In the seventh place, they want to have their militia modeled and disciplined, that upon occasion they may be as serviceable as the regular troops. For an eighth article, the setting up manufactories for linen, stuffs, etc. would be very useful. But the most important alteration would consist in keeping the governors, the intendants, the Supreme Council, the bishops and the Jesuits from splitting into factions and making clubs one against another, for the consequences of such divisions can't but thwart His Majesty's service and the peace of the public. Were this but happily effected, that country would be as rich again as 'tis now. I wonder that instead of banishing the Protestants out of France, who in removing to the countries of our enemies have done so much damage to the kingdom by carrying their money along with them and setting up manufactories in those countries, I wonder, I say, that the court did not think it more proper to transport them to Canada. I'm convinced that if they had received positive assurances of enjoying a liberty of conscience, a great many of them would have made no scruple to go thither. Some have replied upon this head, that the remedy had been worse than the disease, in regard that some time or other they would not have failed to expel the Catholics by the assistance of the English. But I represented to them that the Greeks and Armenians, who are subject to the Grand Signior, and at the same time are of a nation and religion that's different from that of the Turks, I represented, I say, that these dissenting subjects did scarce ever implore the aid of foreign powers in order to rebel and shake off the yoke. In fine, we have more reason to believe that if the Huguenots had been transported to Canada, they had never departed from the fealty they owed to their natural sovereign. But, let that be as it will, I do but speak as that King of Aragon did, who boasted that if God had deigned to consult him, He could have given him seasonable advice with reference to the symmetry and the courses of the stars. For in like manner, I do affirm that if the Council of State had followed my scheme, in the space of 30 or 40 years, New France would have become a finer and more flourishing kingdom than several others in Europe. A discourse of the interest of the French and of the English in North America. Since New France and New England subsist only upon the cod fishery and the fur trade, 'tis the interest of these two colonies to enlarge the number of the ships employed in the fishery, and to encourage the savages to hunt and shoot beavers, by furnishing them with what arms and ammunition they have occasion for. 'Tis well known that there's a great consumption of codfish in the southern countries of Europe, and that few commodities meet with a better and readier market, especially if they are good and well cured. Those who allege that the destruction of the Iroquois would promote the interest of the colonies of New France are strangers to the true interest of that country. For if that were once accomplished, the savages who are now the French allies would turn their greatest enemies, as being then rid of their other fears. They would not fail to call in the English, by reason that their commodities are at once cheaper and more esteemed than ours, and by that means the whole commerce of that white country would be wrested out of our hands. I conclude, therefore, that 'tis the interest of the French to weaken the Iroquois, but not to see them entirely defeated. I own that at this day they are too strong, insomuch that they cut the throats of the savages, our allies, every day. They have nothing less in view than to cut off all the nations they know, let their situation be never so remote from their country. 'Tis our business to reduce them to 1/2 of the power they are now possessed of, if 'twere possible, but we do not go the right way to work. Above these 30 years, their ancient counselors have still remonstrated to the warriors of the 5 nations that 'twas expedient to cut off all the savage nations of Canada, in order to ruin the commerce of the French, and after that to dislodge them of the continent. With this view they have carried the war above 400 or 500 leagues off their country, after the destroying of several different nations in several places, as I showed you before. 'Twould be no difficult matter for the French to draw the Iroquois over to their side, to keep them from plaguing the French allies, and at the same time to engross all the commerce with the 5 Iroquois nations that is now in the hands of the English in New York. This might be easily put in execution, provided the king would allow 10,000 crowns a year for that end. The method of effecting it is this. In the first place, the barks that were formerly made use of about Fort Frontenac must be rebuilt in order to convey to the rivers of the Tsonontuans and the Onontags such commodities as are proper for them, and to sell them for the prime cost in France. Now this would put the king to the charge of about 10,000 crowns for freight, and I'm persuaded that upon that foot the Iroquois would not be such fools as to carry so much as one beaver to the English colonies, and that for 4 reasons. The first is that, whereas they must transport them 60 or 80 leagues upon their backs to New York, they have not above 7 or 8 leagues traveling from their own villages to the banks of the Lake of Frontenac. For a second reason, 'tis manifest that the English can't possibly let them have their commodities so cheap, without being considerable losers, and that thereupon every merchant would drop that sort of trade. The third is drawn from the difficulty of having subsistence upon the road between the Iroquois villages and New York, for the Iroquois go thither in great bodies, for fear of being surprised, and I acquainted you before several times that there's no venison in that side of the country. The fourth reason is this. In marching so far from their villages, they expose their wives, their children, and their superannuated men for a prey to their enemies, who upon that occasion may either kill them or carry them off, and of this we have 2 instances already. Over and above the cheapness of our commodities, 'twould likewise be requisite that we made them presents every year, and at the same time entreated them not to disturb the repose of our confederate savages, who are such fools as to wage war with one another, instead of entering into a joint league in opposition to the Iroquois, the most redoubted of their enemies, and those whom they have most reason to fear. In a word, if we would manage our affairs with the Iroquois to the best advantage, we ought to put in execution that project that I mentioned in my 23rd letter. To allege that these barbarians have a dependence upon the English is a foolish plea, for they are so far from owning any dependence that when they go to New York to truck their skins, they have the confidence to put rates upon the goods they have occasion for, when the merchants offer to raise their price. I have intimated already several times that their respect for the English is tacked to the occasion they have to make use of them, that this is the only motive which induces them to treat the English as their brethren and their friends, and that if the French would sell them the necessaries of life as well as arms and ammunition at easier rates, they would not make many journeys to the English colonies. This is a consideration that ought to be chiefly in our view, for if we minded it to the purpose, they would be cautious of insulting our savage confederates as well as ourselves. The governors general of Canada would do well to employ the sensible men of the country that are acquainted with our confederates, in pressing them to live in a good correspondence with one another, without waging war amongst themselves, for most of the southern nations worm out one another insensibly, which affords matter of joy to the Iroquois. Now, 'twere an easy matter to prevent this fatal mouldering, by threatening to give them no further supplies of commodities in their villages. To this precaution we ought to add that of endeavoring to engage 2 or 3 nations to live together, the Ottawas, for instance, with the Hurons, the Sakis with the Potamatamis, alias Puans. If all those nations who are embarked in a confederacy with us would but agree one with another and put up their quarrels, they would give themselves wholly to the hunting of beavers, which would tend to the enlarging of our commerce, and besides, they would be in a condition of making one joint body when the Iroquois offered to attack either one or the other. 'Tis the interest of the English to persuade these nations that the French have nothing less in view than to destroy them as soon as they meet with an opportunity, that the growing populousness of Canada is a sufficient ground of alarm, that they ought to avoid all commerce with the French, for fear of being betrayed in any way whatsoever, that to hinder the repairing of Fort Frontenac and the rebuilding of barks for that lake is to them a thing of the last importance, by reason that the French might in 24 hours make a descent from thence to their villages, and carry off their ancient men, their women, and their children, at a time when the warriors might be engaged in the hunting of beavers, that they would promote their own interests by waging war with the French from time to time, by ravaging the seigneuries and settlements in the upper part of the country in order to oblige the inhabitants to abdicate the colony and to discourage those who would otherwise remove out of France and settle in Canada, and in fine, that in time of peace 'twould be very proper to stop the coureurs de bois at the cataracts of the Ottawas River, and to seize the arms and ammunition that they carried to the savages upon the lakes. Farther, if the English would pursue their measures to the best advantage, they ought to engage the Tsonnontouans or the Goyogoans to go and settle upon the banks of the Lake Erie, near the mouth of the river of Conde, and at the same time they ought to build a fort there, with some long barks or brigantines, for this is the most convenient and advantageous post of all that country, and that for an infinity of reasons which I am obliged to conceal. Besides this fort, they should build another at the mouth of the river de François, and then 'twould be absolutely impossible for the coureurs de bois to reach the lakes. They ought likewise to engage the savages of Acadia in their interest, which they may do with little charge. The planters of New England should mind this, as well as the fortifying of the ports in which they fish their cod. As for the fitting out of fleets to destroy the colony, I would not advise the English to give themselves that trouble, for supposing they were assured of success, 'tis but some places that can be reckoned worth the while. To conclude, I must say the English in these colonies are too careless and lazy. The French coureurs de bois are much readier for enterprises, and the Canadese are certainly more vigilant and more active. It behoves the inhabitants of New York to enlarge their fur trade by well-concerted enterprises, and those of New England to render the cod fishing more beneficial to the colony, by taking such measures as many other people would, if they were as advantageously seated. I do not intend to speak of the limits of New France and New England, for they were never well adjusted, though indeed 'twould seem that in several treaties of peace between these two kingdoms, the boundaries were in a manner marked out in some places. Whatever is in that matter, the decision of it is too nice a point for one that can't open his mind without pulling an old house upon his head. The end of the first volume. A table explaining some terms made use of in both volumes. A. Astrolabe is a mathematical instrument that can scarce be used in the ocean by reason of the waves. There are two sorts of them. The first are made use of by East India masters at a time when the sea is as smooth as the face of a looking glass. This sort are serviceable in taking the height of the sun by the means of two little pins, which are bored so as to have two dioptric perforations that serve to conduct the rays of light to that luminary. The latter are such as the mathematicians commonly make use of for astronomical observations, and are furbished with azimuths, almucantaras, loxodromic tables, and the concentric and eccentric tables of the sphere. B. Bank of Newfoundland, or bank in general, is a rising ground in the sea which shoots like a hat beyond the other brims. The Bank of Newfoundland has 30 or 40 fathom water and is paved with codfish. Basin is a head of stagnating water, not unlike a pool or lake. Buteau signifies little nets belagged to the end of a stick. The fishermen make use of them to catch fish upon a sandy ground, and especially eels upon the side of St. Lawrence River. Bout de cuivre are nets not unlike buteau, which serve for the same use. Breaking ground signifies the weighing anchor and putting to sea. Brigantine, a small vessel, one deck, built of light of wood, which plies both with oars and sails. 'Tis equally sharp at prow and poop, and is built for a quick sailor. C. Calumet, in general, signifies a pipe, being a Norman word, derived from calumo. The savages do not understand this word, for 'twas introduced to Canada by the Normans when they first settled there, and has still continued in use amongst the French planters. The calumet or pipe is called in the Iroquois language ganondeo, and by other savage nations poagan. Canadese or Canadians are the natives of Canada, sprung from a French father and mother. In the islands of South America, the natives born of French parents are called Creoles. Capa y de Espada, a Gascon title which the people of that province gave in former times by way of irony to the members of the Supreme Council of Canada, because the first councillors wore neither robe nor sword, but walked very gravely with a cane in their hands, both in the city of Quebec and in the hall. Cassetet signifies a club or a headbreaker. The savages call it a san outstick. Outstick signifying the head and a san to break. Channel is a space of pretty deep water between two banks or between two shores. Commonly the channels are enclosed by flats, and for that reason buoys or masts are fixed upon them, in order to direct the pilots who steer either by these marks or by sounding, for they would run the risk of losing their ships if they did not keep exactly to the channel. Coast along, see sweep. Compass of variation. It is larger than the ordinary compasses, and serves to point out the unequal motions of the needle, which leans always to the northeast in the other hemisphere, whereas it still plies to the northwest in this, and meet on this side the equinoctial line. The needle touched with the lodestone departs from the true north a certain number of degrees to the right and left, and mariners compute the degrees of its departure by the means of an alidada and a thread which divides the glass of the compass into two equal parts, and so shows the variation of the needle at sunset, that being the true proper time for making the observation, for at sun rising and at noon one may be deceived by refractions, etc. Coureurs de bois, i.e. forest rangers, are French or Canadese, so called from employing their whole life in the rough exercise of transporting merchandise goods to the lakes of Canada and to all the other countries of that continent, in order to trade with the savages, and in regard that they run in canoes 1,000 leagues up the country, notwithstanding the danger of the sea and enemies. I take it they should rather be called coureurs de risques than coureurs de bois. Eddy, or boiling water, is little watery mountains that rise at the foot of waterfalls or cataracts, just as we see the water place in the cisterns of waterworks. Edge of a bank is the shelving part of it that runs steep like a wall. Feast of Union, a term used by the Iroquois to signify the renewing of the alliance between the 5 Iroquois nations. Flats are a ridge of rocks running under water from one station to another, and rising within 5 or 6 foot at least of the surface of that element, so as to hinder ships, barks, etc., to float upon them. Freight signifies in this book the cargo, though in other cases it signifies likewise the hire or fare. Furl the sails signifies the drawing them up to a heap towards the top mast, not long ways as we do the curtains of a bed, but from below upwards. This is done by 2 ropes that draw up the sail as a string does a purse. Head bars are 2 round pieces of wood, reaching on each side from one end of a canoe to the other. These are the supporters of the canoe, for the ribs and spars are made fast upon them. Keel of a ship is a long piece of the strongest wood, or at least several pieces joined together, to bear the great weight of all the other timber. Kichi Okima is the general name for the Governor-General of Canada among all the savages, whose languages approach to that of the Algonkins. Kichi signifies great, and Okima captain. The Iroquois and Hurons call the Governor-General Onontio. Latitude. Everybody knows that it imports the elevation of the pole, or the distance from a fixed point of the equator. Land carriage signifies the transporting of canoes by land from the foot to the head of a cataract, or from one river to another. Light ships are such as are empty, without any cargo. Poop is the stern or after part of the ship in which the rudder is fixed. Precipice of a bank. See edge. Prow is the head or forepart of a ship, which cuts the water first. Quarter. Though the word quarter in a maritime sense is not well explained, I put the meaning of it to be this. The north quarter comprehends the space that lies between northwest and northeast. The east quarter runs from northeast to southeast. The south quarter comprehends that part of the heavens that falls between southeast and southwest. And the west quarter extends from southwest to northwest. Refitting of a ship signifies the repairing and dressing of it and putting it into a condition to sail by putting in new planks, caulking the seams, etc. Ribs of a canoe are much like those of a pink, only there's this difference, that they line the canoe only on the inside, from one headbar to another, upon which they are inchesed. They have the thickness of 3 crowns and the breadth of 4 inches. Rouge, an instrument for fishing, resembling a beehive. S. Scurvy is a corruption of the mass of blood. There are 2 sorts of it, one called the land scurvy, which loads a man with infirmities that gradually bring him to his grave. The other is the sea scurvy, which infallibly kills a man in 8 days unless he gets ashore. Sheave, i.e. row the wrong way, in order to assist the steersman to steer the boat and to keep the boat in the channel. Shoot, to shoot a waterfall or cataract implies the running a boat down these dangerous precipices, following the stream of the water and steering very nicely. Sledges are a conveniency for traveling, built in an oblong quadrangular form upon 2 pieces of wood, which are 4 foot long and 6 foot broad. Upon the wood there are several pieces of cloth or hide nailed to keep the wind off. These 2 pieces of wood are very hard and well smooth, that they may slide the better on snow or ice. Such are the horse sledges, but those drawn by dogs are open and made of 2 little pieces of hard, smooth and shining wood, which are 1/2 inch thick, 5 foot long, and 1.5 feet broad. Spars are little pieces of cedar wood, of the thickness of a crown, and the breadth of 3 inches, and as long as they can be made. They do the same service to a canoe that a good lining does to a coat. Stand in for land signifies to sail directly towards it. Steer a ship imports the managing of a ship by the means of a rudder, as we do a horse with a bridle, when there's wind enough to work her, but if there be no wind, a ship is more unmovable than a gouty person in an elbow chair. Stem, a tide or the current of a river, i.e. to sail against the current, or to steer for the place from whence the tides or currents come. Strike, to strike the sails or flag signifies the lowering of them, whether it be to submit to an enemy or by reason of high winds. Sweep a coast signifies to sail along the coast side at a reasonable distance. T. Topgallant masts are 2 little masts set upon the 2 topmasts and have 2 sails fitted for them. Topsails are 2 sails fitted for the 2 topmasts which stand directly above the 2 great masts. Traverse. To traverse signifies sailing zigzag or from side to side as a drunken man reels, when the wind is contrary, for then they are obliged to tack sometimes to the right and sometimes to the left, keeping as near to the wind as they can, in order to make what way they can, or at least to prevent their losing ground. Tree of Peace, a symbolic metaphor for peace itself. Finis.